My brother called me a control freak the week before I cut off his free ride. He said it with that lazy smirk he's had since we were kids, the one that means he knows he can push just a little further and I'll back down. He was wrong this time. But I'm getting ahead of myself. The text came in at 6:47 on a Tuesday morning while I was already in the car, already stressed, already running 5 minutes late to a deposition that could not start without me. My daughter Mia was in the back seat in her school uniform, eating a granola bar and asking me questions about dolphins for reasons I still don't fully understand. My husband Owen had left even earlier for a site visit 2 hours north. Our backup plan, the one we'd spent 2 weeks carefully arranging, had just collapsed in a single text message. "Hey, so something came up. Can't do the thing today. Tell Mia we'll make it up to her. Kyle." That was it. No call. No real explanation. Just, something came up. Like watching his own niece for 3 hours while I sat in a conference room was a casual favor he could cancel like a lunch reservation. I pulled over on Elmwood and read it twice. Then I called him. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail. I called my sister-in-law Amber. She answered on the second ring, which meant she was awake, which meant this wasn't an emergency. It was a choice. "Hey," she said, her voice a little too breezy. "Kyle told me he texted you." "Yeah," I said. "He did. What came up exactly?" She paused just a half second too long. "His buddy Marcus got tickets to that morning round at Riverview. You know how hard those are to get. It's kind of a once-in-a-thing." I sat there with the phone pressed to my ear listening to the sound of my daughter humming something in the back seat. "Amber," I said, "I have a deposition in 40 minutes. I told Kyle 2 weeks ago, I put it in the family group chat, I asked him directly 3 days ago and he confirmed." "I know," she said, and she at least had the grace to sound a little uncomfortable. "I told him it was bad timing. But you know how he gets about golf." I did know. I had known my whole life. Kyle got what Kyle wanted and everyone around him adjusted accordingly. That had been the operating principle of our family since before I could remember. I hung up. I found a backup sitter through an app in about 9 minutes, a certified childcare provider named Ms. Joanna who charged emergency rates that made my eye twitch, but who was professional and calm and showed up exactly when she said she would. I dropped Mia off, made the deposition with 2 minutes to spare, and spent the entire day being perfectly competent while a very specific thought crystallized somewhere behind my sternum. I was done. Not dramatically done, not crying in a parking garage done, just quietly, finally, completely done. To understand why that one text broke something permanent in me, you need to understand what the last 4 years had actually looked like. My brother Kyle is 31. He has a nice apartment in a building I know well, because my name is on the lease, not as a co-signer. As the primary leaseholder, that arrangement started 4 years ago when Kyle got out of a difficult stretch, lost his job, had some debt he wasn't talking about, and came to me asking for help. I was 29, 1 year into my position at a mid-sized litigation firm, and I said yes because he was my brother and because I thought it was temporary. It was not temporary. The lease was month to month at first. Then Kyle found a job in restaurant management, seemed to stabilize, and I offered to keep the arrangement going because switching the lease to his name would have required a credit check that, as he put it, wasn't going to go great for him right now. Right now lasted 4 years. The rent had gone up twice. I negotiated both increases directly with the landlord, Harold, a patient 70-year-old man who called me by my first name and sent fruit baskets at Christmas. Kyle never spoke to Harold at all. In Kyle's version of events, he simply lived in an apartment. In reality, he lived in my apartment and paid me back a portion of the rent each month. A portion that over the last 8 months had quietly shrunk from full to about 2/3, with explanations that ranged from a slow month at work, to car trouble, to something vague involving a vet bill for a dog he'd never mentioned owning. I covered the difference without saying anything because saying something felt like starting a fight, and I had enough fights at work. Alongside the lease situation, there was the truck. Kyle drove a pickup I had co-signed when his credit wouldn't qualify him on his own. The understanding was that he'd refinance under his own name within 18 months. That was 3 years ago. Every time I brought up refinancing, he had a reason it wasn't the right moment. The payment came out of a joint account we'd set up for exactly this purpose. I contributed to it every month as a buffer. He contributed sporadically. Then there was Amber. Amber was not a bad person. She was, however, a person who had married Kyle and absorbed his approach to money and accountability as though it were contagious. She worked part-time at a boutique downtown and spent the rest of her time doing something she called content creation, which as far as I could tell meant posting carefully filtered photographs of their apartment on Instagram and occasionally receiving free candles in the mail. She and Kyle talked about their future in a language made entirely of intentions. They were going to save up. They were going to look into that. They were going to figure it out. My husband Owen had been patient about all of this for a long time. Owen was a structural engineer, methodical and measured, the kind of person who doesn't say a thing until he's thought it through completely, and then says it clearly and exactly once. He had said it to me about 8 months earlier while we were cleaning up after dinner. "I just want to make sure we're building something for ourselves too," he said. "Not just for them." I told him I understood. I did understand. I just hadn't done anything about it yet. The morning of the deposition text, Owen was out of town. When he got back that evening, I was sitting at the kitchen table with my laptop open and a glass of wine I hadn't touched. He came in, read my face, set down his bag, and said, "What happened?" I told him. All of it. Not just the text, but the 8 months of partial rent, and the refinancing conversations that went nowhere, and the thing Amber had said. You know how he gets about golf. As though Kyle's desire to watch people hit a small ball around a field was a force of nature that simply had to be accommodated. Owen sat down across from me. He was quiet for a moment. "What do you want to do?" he asked. "I want to stop being the thing that keeps them from having to try," I said. He nodded once, slowly. "Okay," he said. "So let's do that. I want to be clear about something." What I decided to do next was not impulsive, it was not emotional in the way people use that word to mean irrational. I am a litigation attorney. I build cases for a living. I know how to separate what I feel from what I can document, and I know how to move deliberately. What I felt was grief, honestly, and a kind of exhaustion I didn't have a precise word for. What I did was methodical. I spent 3 evenings pulling together records. The lease, the cosign paperwork on the truck, every Venmo and bank transfer from the last 4 years, the partial rents, the occasional lump sums when Kyle had a good month and paid me back some of what he owed, the totals that, when I added them up in a spreadsheet, made me sit back in my chair and look at the ceiling for a while. It wasn't a number I was prepared for. I called my friend Gwen, who was a real estate attorney, and one of the few people I trusted completely. I explained the lease situation. I asked what my options were. She asked me a few questions. Then she said, cleanly and without drama, "You have more control over this than you think." I already knew that. I just needed to hear it from someone outside my own head. The lease renewal was coming up in 6 weeks. Harold had already emailed me asking whether I wanted to roll over for another year or make any changes. I had not yet responded. That window, I realized, was the fulcrum. Everything I wanted to change could pivot on it. I drafted a letter. I sat with it for 2 days, revised it twice, had Gwen read it. Then I called Harold. "Harold," I said, "I need to let you know I won't be renewing the lease in my name. I'm happy to facilitate a conversation between you and the current occupants if they want to apply directly, but I need to be released from the primary leaseholder obligation by the renewal date." Harold was quiet for a moment. He asked if everything was okay. I told him it was a personal decision and I appreciated his patience over the years. He said he understood and that he'd always found me easy to work with, and I felt a strange pang at that, at being easy to work with, because I wondered how long that quality had been something other people simply consumed. Then I called my dad. My father was not the villain in this story. I want to say that plainly. He was a man who had worked hard his whole life, retired to a smaller house in Tucson 2 years ago, and genuinely loved both his kids without quite understanding that the way he expressed that love had taught Kyle a very specific lesson about consequences and who absorbs them. My dad had always smoothed things over for Kyle, not with money, not directly, but with phone calls, with framing, with the gentle ongoing suggestion that Kyle was going through something and needed patience, and that I was the steady one who could handle it. I was tired of being the steady one who could handle it. "Dad," I said, "I need you to know something before Kyle finds out from me. I'm not renewing the lease on his apartment. I'm also reaching out to the loan servicer about the truck cosign. I've been carrying both for 4 years and I'm stepping back." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That's going to hit him pretty hard." "I know," I said. "He's not in a great place financially." "I know that too," I said. "But I am. And I'd like to stay that way." Another pause. "You know he depends on you." "That's the problem, Dad," I said. "I don't think he should." He didn't argue. He didn't fully agree either. He said he'd pray about it, which was his way of ending a conversation he didn't know how to finish. I told him I loved him and meant it and hung up. Then I called the loan servicer. The conversation about the cosign was more complicated than the lease, but not as complicated as Kyle would have assumed. I explained that I wanted to understand my options for removing myself as cosigner. The representative walked me through it. The short version was that Kyle would need to refinance in his own name, which required a credit application, which required Kyle to actually participate in his own financial life. I sent Kyle a certified letter explaining this. I was careful with the language. Factual, not cruel. I stated that I would no longer be available to cosign or guarantee obligations on his behalf after a specific date, 60 days out, giving him time to make arrangements. I did not call Kyle first. I did not give him a preview. I previewed things with Kyle for 4 years. I had warned him and reminded him and given him the benefit of the doubt until the doubt had no more benefit left in it. The letter arrived on a Thursday. I know because he called me Friday morning. I was at my desk eating a sad desk salad and reviewing a motion when my phone lit up. I let it ring twice, then answered. Kyle's voice came through before I'd even said hello. "What the hell is this letter?" "I assume you mean the one from me or the one from the loan servicer," I said. "Both," he said. "What are you doing?" I told him what I told Harold, that I wasn't renewing the lease in my name, that I needed him to refinance the truck. He laughed. It wasn't an amused laugh. "You can't just do that. I live there. My name isn't on anything because you said you'd help me." "I did help you," I said, "for 4 years. And now I need to step back." "You're doing this because of the babysitting thing," he said. And his voice shifted into something I recognized from childhood, that particular mix of accusation and injured innocence he used when he felt cornered. "You're seriously blowing up my whole situation over one morning." "Kyle," I said, "I'm doing this because I've been subsidizing your rent for 8 months. The truck payment comes out of a joint account you haven't contributed to in 3 months, and when I asked you for 3 hours of help with your niece you canceled to watch golf." There was a silence. "Then that's not fair. You make way more money than us." "Yes," I said. "I do. And that's because I worked extremely hard for a very long time. It doesn't mean I'm obligated to fund your life indefinitely. Mom would never have done this to me," he said. Our mother had been gone for 6 years. He knew exactly what that sentence would land like. I sat with it for a moment before I answered. "Mom isn't here," I said. "And I'm not her. You have 60 days on the lease and 60 days on the truck letter. I'd suggest using that time well." I hung up. I am not going to pretend that was easy. I sat in my office for a few minutes doing absolutely nothing, just looking at the framed photo on my desk of me and Owen and Mia at the Oregon coast last summer, all of us sunburned and squinting and laughing at something Owen had said. That picture cost nothing. That afternoon cost the price of gas and a cooler full of sandwiches. It was the best day I'd had in years. And I had very nearly been too burned out and too financially stretched by things that weren't my responsibility to be fully present for it. Amber called an hour later. She was more upset than Kyle had been, which surprised me until I thought about it and realized it shouldn't have. The apartment was Amber's world. In a way it wasn't quite Kyle's. She decorated it. She photographed it. Her entire aesthetic identity lived there. She said things like, "You're tearing our lives apart and you could have at least talked to us first, and I never thought you were like this." I let her talk. I did not raise my voice. I said when she paused that I had given 4 years of notice in the form of covering for them while they didn't fix the underlying problem, and that 60 days was more than legally required. She said, "You're being a lawyer right now instead of a sister." "I'm his sister," I said. "Not his landlord. That's the whole point." She hung up on me. I expected my dad to call and he did that evening. He said Kyle was very upset. I said I understood. He asked if there was any flexibility on the timeline. I said there wasn't. He asked if I had really thought this through, and I said, "Dad, I've been thinking about this for 4 years." The next 10 days were what I would describe as active interference. Kyle showed up at our house on a Sunday while Owen and I were doing yard work. He didn't call first. He walked around the side of the fence and came into the backyard and stood there with his hands in his pockets, looking like a man preparing a speech he hadn't quite finished writing. Owen looked at me. I gave him a small nod. He took Mia inside with the excuse of getting lemonade. Kyle said a lot of things, that I was punishing him for one mistake, that everything in his life was connected to the arrangements we had and I was pulling the thread that held it together, that Amber was crying every day, that he didn't understand what had happened to me, meaning he didn't understand why I had stopped being the person who absorbed his consequences, and he framed that as a personality change rather than a decision. I listened. Then I said, "I'm not angry at you. I want you to know that. I'm not doing this to hurt you. I'm doing it because the way things have been set up hasn't been good for either of us, and I should have changed it sooner." He looked at me for a moment and something moved across his face. I thought for just a second he might actually hear it. Then he said, "What am I supposed to tell Amber? That you need to figure your finances out like every other adult in the country," I said. He left. He didn't slam the gate, which I took as a small mercy. What I had not told Kyle because I was waiting for the right moment was that there was a second thing. I had gone back into the joint account we'd set up for the truck payment. I had agreed to be on this account as a buffer in case his contributions fell short. What I found when I looked at the full history was that over the last 6 months, there had been a series of withdrawals, small ones, taken out with a debit card linked to the account. Not truck payments, purchases, a bar tab on a Friday night in April, tickets to a concert in March, a charge from a golf shop in January, $212, purchased 10 days before Kyle had told me he was having a slow month at work and couldn't cover his full portion of the rent. I ran the numbers. It wasn't enormous in absolute terms, but it was money he had taken from a shared account designated for a specific purpose to cover something I was already co-signing and used it for himself without mentioning it. I photographed the statements. I sent them to Gwen with a note asking her professional opinion. She called me back in 20 minutes. "That's misuse of a joint account," she said. "Whether you want to pursue it formally or just use it as context, document it. You have it in writing." I wasn't going to sue my brother, but I was going to let him know that I knew. The second conversation happened at the end of week 3. Kyle called me, less aggressive this time, more tired. He said he'd talked to Harold and Harold had told him the credit application was going to be a process. He said he'd called the loan servicer and understood now what refinancing would take. He said he and Amber were looking at other apartments and everything was more expensive than they realized. Welcome, I did not say out loud. Welcome to what things cost when someone else isn't quietly making up the difference. I said, "I'm glad you're taking it seriously." And then I said, "I also need to talk to you about the joint account." I walked him through what I'd found. The bar tab, the concert, the golf shop charge from January. The silence on his end was different from his previous silences. Less angry, more exposed. "I didn't think it was a big deal," he said. "I know," I said. "That's what concerns me. You are using money designated for a loan I co-signed to buy yourself things, and you told me the same month that you couldn't cover rent. I was going to pay it back. But you didn't tell me," I said. "You let me think the shortfall was because of circumstances outside your control. That wasn't honest." He didn't have an answer for that. He said he was sorry. I believed him. Not entirely, but enough to file it away as a real acknowledgement rather than a tactical one. "I want to tell you something," I said. "Not to rub it in, just because I think you should hear it. I totaled up what I've contributed over 4 years. The rent differential, the account buffer, the times I covered the full truck payment when you missed it. The number is not small, and I covered it because you're my brother, and I love you. And I want you to understand I'm not doing this because that number makes me angry. I'm doing it because I don't want to spend the next 4 years building the same total." Another long pause. "What do you want from me?" he said. His voice was tired in a way I hadn't heard before. "I want you to build something that's actually yours," I said. "I want to come to Thanksgiving in 3 years and hear you tell me about a problem you solved on your own. That's what I want." He made a sound that might have been a laugh or might have been something else. I didn't push for clarification. The lease ended. Kyle and Amber moved into a smaller apartment a few miles away. It was a real lease in Kyle's name. Amber had apparently picked up a second job, something remote data entry or scheduling. I didn't ask for details, but I registered that she'd done it. The truck refinancing took 6 weeks and was probably painful, but it happened. I signed off the cosign and felt something loosen in my chest that I hadn't fully realized was there. My dad called me when the move was done. He said Kyle seemed more settled than he'd been in a while. I said I was glad. He said, "I think you did the right thing," and I could tell it had taken him some time to arrive at that sentence, which made it mean more, not less. Owen and I spent the money we'd been contributing to the buffer account on a long weekend in Santa Fe. We ate good food and slept late and walked around markets in the mornings, and I did not think about lease renewals or loan servicers or partial rent payments even once. Mia made friends with a kid at the hotel pool, and they spent an entire afternoon on a complicated game neither Owen nor I fully understood. On the last night, Owen said, "You seem like yourself again." "I think I am," I said. The thing I've come to understand, looking back at all of it, is that being the responsible one in a family can become a kind of tax that gets levied silently over years and years. No one sits you down and explains the terms. You just find yourself, one morning, pulled over on a side street reading a text from your brother about golf. And something that had been building for a long time, finally, quietly, reaches its limit. I don't regret the 4 years. I regret that I waited so long to change the terms. If I had said sooner, clearly and without apology, this arrangement has an end date, I think it would have been better for both of us. Kyle needed to be uncomfortable in order to build something real. I kept him comfortable for so long that discomfort felt like cruelty when it finally came. It wasn't. It was just reality, deferred. Mia came home from school about a month after everything had settled and announced that she wanted to start a business selling bookmarks. She had a whole plan. She'd costed out materials, figured out a price, designed the product. She was 8. I sat with her at the kitchen table while she walked me through it. Completely serious. This tiny person with a spreadsheet she'd made in Google Docs with Owen's help. And I thought, okay, this is what it looks like when someone builds something for themselves. I bought the first one, paid full price, didn't offer her a subsidy, she didn't need one. I've thought a lot about what it actually means to love someone without enabling them, and I don't think those two things are as easy to separate as people pretend. When Kyle canceled that morning, I didn't hate him. I was tired of a pattern, which is a different thing entirely. Hatred is loud. What I felt was quieter and honestly sadder. It was the feeling of finally admitting that the help I'd been giving him for 4 years hadn't been helping him at all. It had been helping me avoid the discomfort of watching him struggle. That's the part nobody talks about when they tell stories like mine. The person doing the enabling isn't always naive. Sometimes they know exactly what's happening and they keep going anyway, because the alternative, watching someone you love hit a wall, feels unbearable. I told myself I was being generous. The truth is, I was also being a coward in my own quiet way. Every time I covered the rent differential without saying anything, every time I let the refinancing conversation drift, I was choosing my own short-term peace over Kyle's long-term growth. That's not a generous act. That's a selfish one dressed up in generous clothing. What I've come to understand is that the consequences of our choices don't disappear just because someone else absorbs them. They just get transferred. Kyle never felt the real weight of his financial decisions because I was always there catching a fall before it reached him. So he kept making the same decisions. Not because he was a bad person, but because nothing in his experience had taught him that those decisions had a cost. I had removed the cost. I thought I was protecting him. I was actually keeping him exactly where he was. The moment I stopped absorbing his consequences, he had to start absorbing them himself. It was uncomfortable. It was probably the most uncomfortable stretch of his adult life, and from what my dad told me after the move, he came out of it more settled than he'd been in years. That's not a coincidence. That's what happens when a person finally has to build something load-bearing with their own hands. They discover they can, and that discovery is worth more than anything I could have paid for on his behalf. I think about Mia and her bookmark business sometimes when I'm trying to articulate why all of this mattered. She came to Owen and me with a plan she had made herself. She didn't ask us to fund it or run it or make the uncertainty go away. She just wanted us to see it. And because we hadn't hollowed out her initiative by preemptively solving every problem before she could reach it, she had initiative. She had the confidence that comes from having figured something out yourself. That's what I want for Kyle, eventually. Not to be punished. Not to struggle forever. Just to know, somewhere solid in his chest, that what he has is actually his. That he built it. That it holds because he made it hold. I am not the moral authority on how families should operate. I made mistakes in this story too, and I've tried to be honest about that. I waited too long. I covered too much. I made it easy for everyone, including myself, to pretend the arrangement was fine when it clearly wasn't. But I do believe this. Integrity isn't just about the big dramatic moments. It lives in the small ones. And whether you tell the truth about a joint account, and whether you show up when you said you would, and whether you build your life or borrow someone else's. Kyle is learning that now. I think, given enough time, it will be the most useful thing that ever happened to him. And Owen and I are in Santa Fe in my memory, eating breakfast on a patio in the early morning light, and nobody needs anything from me that I haven't already chosen to give. That's what it feels like to be free.